It was one of those days where everything felt heavy. I was sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching a case unfold that felt unfair right from the start. The judge, a man in his late 50s, sat up high on the bench, his expression hard and unfeeling. He was used to power, used to judging people who had no voice. And then there was her, the girl, the defendant. She couldn't have been older than 16, wearing a simple white blouse and black pants, looking so out of place in that big, cold courtroom. Her skin was a deep, beautiful shade of brown, and her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, but the way she carried herself, well, it felt like something was being hidden. The judge started with his usual condescending tone, speaking to her like she was just some teenager who didn't know better, who was in trouble. "You have any idea where you are, young lady?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "This isn't a playground." She didn't flinch, not even a little. Her eyes stayed steady, calm, but I could see the way her hand tightened into a fist on the edge of the table. It was clear she wasn't intimidated. I felt this knot in my stomach, the kind you get when you know something isn't right, when you know that someone is being underestimated. The judge kept going, cracking jokes about her appearance, calling her just another lost kid. I could feel the weight of every word, like a blow to her self-esteem, to her future. But there was something in the way she stood there, so poised despite the ridicule. I couldn't look away. Something told me she wasn't who she seemed. I watched closely, my heart racing a little. Something was about to happen. I could feel it in my bones. The judge had just finished his usual round of sarcastic remarks, laughing like he'd said something clever. He was completely sure of himself. And then, without any warning, the girl spoke up. Her voice was clear, calm, but there was a firmness to it that I didn't expect. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I think you have misunderstood the situation." The courtroom went silent. I leaned forward, unsure of what was coming next. The judge looked like he was about to dismiss her, his eyebrow raised, his smirk still plastered on his face, but something in her tone made him pause. "What do you mean, misunderstood?" he asked, almost scoffing, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Are you going to lecture me now?" Her gaze didn't falter. She wasn't shaking, wasn't backing down. "I am not a lost kid, as you called me, and I'm certainly not in trouble." The judge laughed, but it wasn't a genuine laugh. It was forced, uncomfortable. I could see him beginning to realize that something was wrong, but he still didn't understand. "All right, so what are you then?" he asked, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I'm your lawyer, Your Honor," she said, finally revealing it. There was a collective gasp in the room. My jaw nearly hit the floor. I blinked, certain I hadn't heard her correctly. "I'm sorry?" The judge looked like he'd been slapped. "I'm a lawyer," she repeated, her voice unwavering. "I've been a practicing attorney for 3 years." The judge just stared at her, utterly speechless. His face went from smug to pale. He opened his mouth but couldn't seem to find any words. It hit me all at once. She wasn't just some random teenager. She was someone who had been hiding in plain sight, and the world had no idea who she really was. The air in the courtroom felt thick, like it was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could hear the muffled noise of the judge shuffling papers, but it all seemed distant. Everything had slowed down. The tension was so heavy it almost felt suffocating. My eyes couldn't look away from the girl. She was standing tall now, like someone who had just found her place in the world. Her shoulders were straight, her eyes steady and unwavering. The defiant, confident stance she held now felt miles away from the scared, uncertain girl who had first stepped into that room. I wasn't looking at just a teenager anymore. No, I realized in that moment she was something much more. She wasn't just a defendant caught up in something she didn't deserve. She was a force, a person with the power to change everything. She cleared her throat, and when she spoke, her voice was louder than before, no longer shaky or uncertain. It was commanding, steady, like someone who had been through more than most people could ever imagine. "I've been working undercover for a firm in New York for the past year," she said. Her words cut through the air like a sharp blade, and every person in the room leaned forward, as though they couldn't believe what they were hearing. "And yes, I am only 16. But the legal system made me grow up faster than most." There was no bitterness in her voice, just a quiet truth. A truth that, for the first time I could see, was powerful enough to shatter every stereotype and assumption people had about her. She wasn't just some kid in trouble. She wasn't someone who was lost or naive. She was smart, she was capable, and she had been working harder than any of us ever knew. She reached into her bag, pulling out a set of neatly stacked documents. The rustling sound of paper echoed in the quiet room as she placed them on the table in front of the judge. "These are case files from my firm," she said, her fingers brushing over the papers as she laid them out. "Evidence of my legal work and credentials. I didn't come here to be judged based on my age or appearance. I came here to handle this case with the expertise it deserves." And just like that, everything changed. The room went still, completely still. It was the kind of stillness that you only get when the world has just been turned upside down. The kind of silence that comes when everyone realizes they've been wrong about something, about someone, and the weight of that realization hits them like a ton of bricks. I couldn't take my eyes off her. I glanced at the judge. His face, once so smug and confident, was now completely different. His hands were trembling, a subtle shake that betrayed the shock running through him. His mouth hung open, but no words came out. He reached for the papers she had placed in front of him, his fingers hesitating for a moment before he grabbed them, scanning the documents with growing disbelief. The realization of what he had just done hit him slowly, almost painfully. He had underestimated her, brushed her off without a second thought, based on nothing more than her youth, her race, the way she looked. And now, in front of him, in front of everyone in that room, she was showing him how wrong he had been. His face twisted with embarrassment as he read the papers, documents, proof, evidence of her brilliance, her hard work. With every line his eyes moved over, his confidence seemed to evaporate more and more. The arrogance that had been there earlier? Gone. Replaced with something I hadn't expected to see, a man who was humiliated by his own mistake. I felt something shift inside me, a rush of emotions that I hadn't expected. There was pride, so much pride for this girl who had stood up for herself, for what she believed in, for the truth. But it wasn't just pride for her. It was pride for anyone who had ever been judged by the way they looked, by their skin, by their age, by anything they couldn't control. In that moment, I realized that she wasn't just showing them her brilliance. She was showing all of us that we are more than the boxes society tries to put us in. She had made a statement, a loud, clear statement, that we should never be underestimated, not by anyone. And I wasn't just watching this happen, I was witnessing it. I was there, right there, watching the world around her change as the truth was revealed. The girl, this quiet genius in disguise, had just shown them all. She had proven them wrong in a way they'd never forget. And I was there, seeing it all unfold. The judge cleared his throat, his hand briefly covering his mouth, as if he were trying to hide the shock that had taken hold of him. I could see the tightness in his shoulders, the way his hands shook ever so slightly as he tried to regain control over the situation. But something had shifted in the room, something he couldn't ignore. He was a man who had always believed he held all the power, who had confidently looked down on others from his position of authority. He thought people like her, young, black, and seemingly out of place in his world, didn't belong in his courtroom. He thought he had the upper hand. But now, looking at her, looking at the calm yet unwavering confidence in her eyes, he knew he had made the worst mistake of his life. I could almost see the layers of arrogance and judgment peeling away from him, replaced by something he'd rarely shown: respect. It wasn't a quiet respect, but the kind that shakes you to your core. He had been humbled in front of everyone. The entire courtroom had felt the shift. The atmosphere, once filled with condescension and disbelief, had now become thick with awe and curiosity. The people sitting in those old wooden chairs who had been silently watching the drama unfold now watched with wide eyes. They were no longer looking at just some teenage girl. They were witnessing something extraordinary. Something that made them rethink every assumption they'd ever held about power, intelligence, and what a person could accomplish when they weren't seen for what they truly were. I watched as the prosecutor, who had been sitting back so comfortably, looking ready to brush her off like just another case, suddenly seemed small. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His face turned red as he realized just how badly he had misjudged her, just like everyone else in that room. All that confidence he had displayed earlier now crumbled. His posture slumped as the weight of the moment crushed him. He had been caught up in the image of a naive girl, and now he saw her for what she truly was: a professional, a genius, and someone far beyond his understanding. The judge's movements were slow as he stood, still trying to regain some sense of composure. His voice came out steady at first, but I could hear the shift in tone, the subtle softness that hadn't been there before. I apologize, young lady," he said, his voice almost apologetic now. It was as if the weight of his earlier mockery was too much for him to bear. I had no idea who I was dealing with. He took a deep breath, the realization of his own foolishness washing over him like a cold shower. "You are clearly more than capable of handling this case on your own." There was a pause, just long enough for the judge's words to fully settle. And then she spoke. Her smile wasn't the triumphant, smug grin you'd expect from someone who had just proven all her doubters wrong. It wasn't self-righteous. It was gentle, almost serene, a smile that carried with it the weight of a long, difficult journey and the peaceful knowledge that the truth had finally come to light. "I thought you might," she said softly, her voice calm, almost as if nothing in the world could rattle her anymore. Her words, simple but profound, settled in the air like the final stroke of a painter's brush. "Now, let's get back to business, Your Honor." And with that, it was as though the room exhaled collectively, releasing the tension that had built up. The judge nodded, and the courtroom fell into a stunned silence. No one spoke. No one dared to disrupt the fragile balance she had created in that room. She had taken control, not with anger or defiance, but with grace, intelligence, and an unwavering sense of who she was. It was a moment of pure strength. The courtroom was never the same after that. The walls, the chairs, the faces of everyone there, they had witnessed something far beyond just a legal case. They had seen the quiet power of someone who refused to be defined by their circumstances, who stood firm in the face of doubt and judgment, and who changed the course of an entire moment with nothing more than the truth. I, for one, would never forget this day. I would never forget the way she stood tall, not just as a defendant, but as a brilliant, capable lawyer, someone who had hidden in plain sight, unnoticed by those who were too eager to judge her. She wasn't just a lawyer, she was a force to be reckoned with. A living example of what happens when the world underestimates someone with the strength to prove them wrong. And as I looked at her, watching the way she calmly took charge of the situation, I realized something I hadn't before. This wasn't just her victory. It was the victory of anyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. It was a reminder that strength isn't always loud, but it's always undeniable. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more powerful moments like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to like if it resonated with you, and leave a comment to let us know your thoughts or share your own experiences. Share this with your friends and family so they can witness these inspiring stories too. Your support means the world and helps us keep creating more content just like this. Thank you.